we're going to take questions at the end of the session, so we're just going to crack on and then have some discussion. Hopefully there will be time for discussion later. So I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to cover some ground, some of which is old ground, I'll be absolutely honest with you, but with one or two perhaps new twists and new ideas and a little tiny bit of new research. The Ruddygore portraits, Ray's already warmed it up beautifully in terms of the context within the Savoy canon. Gilbert's idea for Ruddygore is based on his earlier piece with music by Frederick Clay ages ago, a piece that we were involved in recreating at what was then the Harrogate Gilbert Sullivan Festival a few years ago. And then, typically like Gilbert, you never throw a good idea away. You pick it up and you develop it and grow it into Ruddygore. Note, of course, the spelling, which is different. The press really took quite a significant offence at this when it first was published. And quite soon after the first performance, the name was remodelled and an I replaced the Y. In the piece, there are a number of interesting uses of trapdoors, etc., and techniques. I think really the whole piece of Ruddygore is misunderstood today because it's poking fun at 19th century melodrama, and the melodrama of which the Gilbert's audience was wholly familiar, the traditions, some of them utterly ridiculous. This was all the contextual humour. So it's not just about a ghost story, it's poking fun. It's the theatrical tradition that goes before it. In that piece, there's even a melodrama piece which plays a piece of music. It's not a song. And in this piece, we see a trapdoor being actually used for the reappearance of one of the ghosts. And it's quite an interesting piece. Those of you who may have recently read, this is the melodrama music, read a review of Ruddygore in the stage quite recently, would note that the reviewer for the stage took to the piece and seriously criticised the director and the musical director for introducing a piece of silent movie music into a 19th century piece. The reviewer had absolutely no clue of what he was watching. This is Gilbert and Sullivan actually almost foretelling the idea of the chase in a silent movie, but it's also absolutely born in the traditions of melodrama. And you can actually see that invigoration in the line that Sullivan's scoring as the movement is going on the actual chase itself. And you see that now it builds and builds and builds and builds and builds and builds the climax up to the point where the figure in the trapdoor actually pops up. And this is Sir Roderick, the major character, the major ghost of Act 2. Thank you. And here we see him. He's popped up through the trapdoor. This might have been what it looked like. This is actually Hamlet under the stage, the opera Hamlet actually, under the stage. But this would have been how the stagehand might have opened the trap to allow Sir Roderick to rise up. This is a photograph taken before the fire, here, but underneath, on the platform of the trap, which Sir Roderick would have risen up through the stage. And if we look at the long section of the Savoy, we can quite clearly see here the substage and the depth which they actually had to work with. So this trap would have been roughly here, set stage left, roughly where I'm stood. Set out within the traditions of the English wood stage. So we're actually talking about this trapdoor here within all this wonderful machinery, which we'll hopefully have an opportunity to see during the course of the day. Here's another kind of example of it at the Woolwich Artillery Theatre, one of the military theatres in London. But back to Ruddygore, and I'm really cruising on quickly, to the ghost scene. This is the scene when Gilbert brings back to life the portraits, the idea in ages ago, which I told you about before, comes back to life, and look at these portraits. Just kind of think about some of these characters. You can see that although they are members largely of the male chorus, they are all very much individual characters. This is not like in Patience, the Dragoon Guards. These all have very, very specific characters and, of course, dates, because it's the lineage of the Murgatroyd family that we're actually looking at, the generations. And in Ruddygore, there are many allusions to things, such as, alas, poor ghost, from Hamlet. And these are all jokes, that a lot of which is lost today on our modern day audiences, but which Gilbert had absolute joy in poking fun at. Here's the procession, and once they've come, another take. This is the Illustrated London News, the earlier one. This is Sporting and Dramatic News. The early one was the Illustrated News. And, you know, as Race told us today, many different ideas and recreations of the different types of sets. Which one's this, Ray? Which design is this? British Goffin. It's the Peter Goffin one with Donald Adams in the centre there as Sir Roderick Murgatroyd himself. But he did come back into repertoire, and occasionally it was performed in other places. I've just put this in because it's not often seen. This is actually a production of Ruddygore at the Royal College of Music. So it was sufficiently respectable in those days for Gilbert and Sullivan to actually be performed at the Royal College of Music. But we see these sets and these characters many times in the revivals and the illustrated papers of the time. This is the other half of the family. Click. Go back. No, seem to have lost click. Can we go to computer? Yeah. So here's the other half of the family. But I want to stop here for a minute. I have to race quickly because of time, and not to preempt what Karen's going to say about Normansfield, but I now want to take you. So I'm the curtain raiser for Karen, really, in terms of what we're going to hear about later. Normansfield Amusement Hall, built as what was then called a lunatic asylum, a theatre in a lunatic asylum in the 19th century, the 1870s. Designed by Roland Plum, an architect of note, but of no theatrical note. This is an entertainment hall rather than a theatre, which could perform many functions. Quite forward-thinking. Langdon Down, who built the hospital, was the first man to recognise that Down syndrome, Langdon Down, was in fact a genetic trait, and it was a consistency. So these people were not mad. There was something wrong, and he identified that there was a genetic issue with these people, and saw that theatrical performance could be hugely therapeutic in bringing to life people and create a sense of community within Normansfield. When I first went there, which was a long while ago, in the early 1980s, this was kind of literally what we found. And I was incredibly fortunate. I was probably in the right place at the right time. Much of this scenery had been absolutely and completely untouched or undamaged. It now represents the best collection of 19th century theatrical scenery in Great Britain. And there are many pieces to it. Here's the street scene. And some of these are quite generic, and some of them are actually stencil signed with the name of the studio from where they came. And they came from all different places, importantly. The Normansfield pioneers, or the people that I have the joy of working with. Terence Rees, of the book Theatre Lighting in the Age of Gas. The lovely Colin Sorensen, who was Keeper of Modern Folk Culture at the Museum of London. And he was a man who was going around recording and photographing derelict London theatres that had been bombed out after the war, before they were finally bulldozed. There was that 10-year period after the war when theatres just lay absolutely derelict, having been severely attacked by bombing. And the guy on the far left is Jeff Marsh, who became the head of the theatre collection at the V&A, Theatre Museum as it was when it was in Covent Garden. And there's that chap David Wilmore here with hair and slightly less body, perhaps, than he's got today. Colin Bottomley, who was the architect for the project we worked on, and I'm sad to say, another, whose name sadly no longer rests in my head. But we were the first people who were, I suppose, let loose into the collection to see what it was. And here was all this wonderful stuff rolled up. Nobody had seen it for years. All these extraordinary scenes. They've been used, etc., etc. Why am I showing you this? Well, because the fantastic work that Ray has done, and backed up to a legend, if you haven't got a copy, try and get hold of a copy. It's absolutely definitive as far as I'm concerned. But the interesting thing is that's come out of Ray's talk today is the way that we've turned over so many different sets with the D'Oyly Carte. It's been, there's been good and bad, there have been changes, different designers, different takes. And I think Ray's earlier point about, there's a perception that the D'Oyly Carte was just the same and, never changed. Is clearly, he's proved to us today, it's absolute and utter rubbish. But although lots of the D'Oyly Carte scenery was actually stored, it was quite often also sold. Now, we've heard a bit today already about the scenic workshops in London, which centred around the West End. There were some of them were in the West End, so we got paint frames in Drury Lane. The Greaves had a paint shop just round the corner from Drury Lane. Hemsley's was a little bit across the water, but they were all within cartage of the West End, so that they could, they could work obviously with all the theatres. But from time to time, they must have disposed of stuff. Probably the most complete theatrical scenic workshop, I would say today, which is slap bang in the West End, is not the Drury Lane paint shop, which sadly has been recently modified, inverted commas. It's actually Elms Leicester. And the paint shop at Elms Leicester is extraordinary for a number of reasons. One, it still has its 4 paint frames intact, or it did last time I was in there. It's a bespoke, dedicated building, not a conversion. It's specifically designed for the manufacturing of theatrical scenery, slap bang in the West End. And if you want to know where it is, it's just off Charing Cross Road, sort of behind Shaftesbury Avenue, that sort of end, just over from Palace Theatre. What was the Savile? It's just behind the Savile Theatre there. And to my extraordinary surprise, quite recently, I found this, which is an Elms Leicester catalogue, which I'd never seen before, which shows clearly the paint frames looking down the length at first floor level. And it's actually a catalogue of stuff they want to move on. So they're about to sell it. And I want you all, it's a very small thing. This is the only picture in it. But this one is of particular interest, where we see Savoy Theatre. And here we have a few things that they're flogging off. This is June the 18th, 1901. And, we've got a bell, a stand, and gongs, pistols. So we can only begin to imagine what plated drinking cups looked like, or Harold's trumpets, 1901. Maybe the Grand Duke Harold's trumpets from the Grand Duke of 1896. But interesting. And what are, because I'm not quite sure, what are up-to-your seats? Quite interesting. But this absolutely establishes the principle that this scenery was in a constant state of flux. And even, certainly 20 years ago, when I'd go to scenic warehouses, I'd quite often find a random flat from the Mikado, a D'Oyly Carte flat from the Mikado, that was now, had somehow found its way into an amateur production. And it had been bought or sold or moved on. Now, some of you who are of a certain age, and I certainly do include myself in that, might remember a bookshop in London called Andrew Block's. If you don't, Andrew was extraordinary. He was Dickensian in the way he ran this shop, and you would go into the shop and, yeah, there were bookshelves, but there were also kind of papers and volumes piled high on the desk. And he had an assistant called Meg, and you had to culture yourself and your relationship, because Andrew wasn't in the business of selling his books to people who he did not consider were suitable owners of it. And so you had to serve your apprenticeship with Andrew, and especially with Meg, in order to gain access to the inner sanctums in the cellar of the bookshop and in the back rooms of the bookshop, where all the most interesting stuff, obviously, was kept. At that time, Terence Rees, whom you've seen and who I've mentioned, a great friend, sadly no longer with us, had a great relationship with Andrew, and he introduced me to Andrew and indeed to Meg, and slowly but surely one gained their confidence, I suppose. One day, Terence Rees was in there, and Andrew said, "Oh, you might find this of interest. It's something to do with Ruddygore," and ferreted around and brought out a single sheet of paper, extracted from a magazine, the masthead of which had been removed, so there was no idea where this blooming thing had come from. But it talked about the sale of the Ruddygore portraits after Carter decided to discontinue it in the repertoire. And for years and years and years, Terence and I, this is pre-fax, never mind pre-internet, looked for the other page or pages of this article. But nevertheless, what was in this article in itself was extraordinary, because it was from an illustrated paper, and the reporter had been to the auction where D'Oyly Carte was selling off the scenery. And so we can only begin to imagine, this looks to me like it could well be one of the pillars from the Gondoliers, the top of the pillar from the Gondoliers in St. Mark's. On the other hand, here's everybody at the sale, and we can quite clearly see flats and backdrops, and they're all a bit foggy, but you kind of get the impression. You kind of get the impression of what's going on. Here's another one. And you can see the chaotic manner in which, it must have been laid out in the auction house. A minor auction house. It's not. This isn't a Christie's. This is somebody on the South Bank in a fairly small auction house, and they've obviously just decided to get rid of the whole lot. And here we are with, the actual auctioneer knocking down the lots. And there's a narrative that goes with this that tells the story of the sale. Well, this must surely be the Gondoliers that's for sale. And wait a minute, what's this? Portraits? Indeed, portraits. Let's just go back. On the left, we saw this picture earlier. The gentleman in the herringbone costume. In the left, a picture taken from the revival from the Illustrated London News from post-war revival. On the right, a piece of scenery which Terence Rees and I rediscovered at Normansfield on that extraordinary visit that I've told you about. And we were taken that clearly this surely must be for a production of Ruddygore. A production of Ruddygore. Nothing more. But wait a minute. When we turned the flats round and we took the original 1880s production of Ruddygore, we started to play around, because on the back of these portraits were numbers. And we knew scenically how it had originally been laid out in the 1880s production. And we were able to see that both sets of, all sets of portraits, and sadly not all of the portraits at Normansfield survive, had two numbers on them. And we worked out the code, which basically was that you had an OP code and a prompt code, and then you had a sequential code that took you from downstage right around to downstage left. So that by having two numbers, you could always place exactly where that portrait went when you were fitting it up. And these numbers tallied in quite an extraordinary way with the positions in the 1880 production, the original production of Ruddygore. And we came to the conclusion, on this light bulb moment, oh my God, we are looking at the original portraits from the original production. And the article which I've shown you was the article of the auction of the portraits, which we've subsequently now found comes from the Pall Mall Budget magazine, and we found the other missing page of that article, which ties the whole thing together. So these were sold off, and we can only imagine that Dr. Langdon Down took himself off down to the auction for his private theatre, which would by then be sort of 10 years old, and purchased for 5 guineas, I think it was, all or a portion of those original Ruddygore portraits. And there, extraordinarily, they hung on the wall at Normansfield for all those years, unidentified and unadorned. We're now going to dim the lights a little bit, and we're going to play another music cue. Now, this is taken from the moment that the portraits come to life. Now, if you're scared of the dark, hold hands now. If you feel that the portraits might come alive, just imagine what it might have felt like to the Victorian audience of the 1880s at the Savoy. So, when we're ready, guys, let's just take the house lights right down with a bit of seagull accompaniment. Okay. Slowly down to a sort of blackdown. And the whole thing was created for this extraordinary moment. Now, we've heard about incandescent light, and we've heard about how the Savoy was lit with those lamps. So imagine the light going down, down, down. And then the portraits come to life on this stage. Sullivan's conducting in the pit, and because the lighting levels are so very, very low, Sullivan has a conducting baton with a light in the end so that the portraits can actually see the conductor. The portraits start slowly to animate. Just try and imagine what this must have been like. I always say to people, we're all contaminated by the 21st century. Special effects on TV, films, computers. But this was the real magic. The melodrama, the extraordinary experience that they were able to convey for this kind of thing. Now, we know that there were many more portraits that survived at Normansfield. Sadly, some of them have been lost. But we can begin to imagine that they would appear from their portraits and walk down. Indeed, when you start to compare the images of some of the members of the chorus who were actually in the production, these individuals are recognisable as actually people. They're not just general faces. Now, what I'm playing to you is a slightly different version of what some of you might be familiar with. This is the original portrait coming to life music, which was subsequently cut from later performances after they'd reassessed it. But this whole scene must have extended for a significant amount of time. You hear how Sullivan pauses the score, and one can only start to imagine that each phrase of music here is one of the individual portraits stepping out and down. Pause again. He takes his place on the stage. Drum roll, more drama, and then it moves on again to the next portrait, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we see that these are the surviving four that I have pictures of today, in pretty good condition. To my eternal horror, and no fault of Colin Sorensen whatsoever, the portraits were removed for, in inverted commas, safekeeping while the building work was being carried out by the Museum of London. These, we actually believe, are the original frames that they're in from the Savoy production, and they actually had central pivot points so they could spin, and we think that they then allowed the real portrait to stand out. When they were returned, after safekeeping, the frames have been removed and are lost. But at least they are recorded for posterity. Thank you. So there we are, the story of the Ruddygore portraits. An extraordinary thing, something that one actually never expects to discover. There's our friend, the herringbone man, and of course, Sir Roderick. Sadly, Sir Roderick's portrait doesn't survive. He's the main character in the piece, the central portrait. This is Donald Adams. But we can only imagine the four of them stepping out onto that extraordinary sort of image. 1, 2, 3, and 4. The story of the Ruddygore portraits. Thank you very much. I'll now hand over to Karen, who's going to tell us much more about the whole collection and the story behind it. So I'll hand over to Karen. And then after that, we'll take some questions.